After a week, we had a break week last week. This is a lucky number, I think. Number 10 is always a good lucky number, and that's the meeting we are conducting today. So that was pursuant to the motion on October 27th, 2020. We're proceeding with two briefings. The first, which will deal with Southern Cameroon, and the second, which will deal with Ethiopia. Members, you're aware, just as we get into the questioning of the witnesses, when it gets down to about 30 seconds or so left of your time, I'll just kind of flash the card, just so you're aware that you have about 30 seconds left and to conclude. For those that have not used this platform, maybe our witnesses, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe, and on that globe, you're able to choose interpretation, so in English or French. So on that note, I am going to welcome our witnesses. And so welcome from the USC Gould School of Law International Human Rights Clinic. We have Hannah Gary, the director there. From the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, the Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa Programs, Christopher Fominyen. And from the Oasis Network for Community Transformation, Chair of Cameroon Working Group, we've got Tembon. He's the Executive Director. We are going to start. So witnesses, you'll have 5 minutes to provide your opening remarks, and then it will go to members for questions. We'll start with Ms. Hannah Gary, and you've got 5 minutes, Ms. Gary.
Thank you so much, and good evening, honorable members of the subcommittee. It really is a privilege to brief you all on the current situation in Cameroon, and I really appreciate this opportunity. As was mentioned, I'm clinical director of law and founding director of the USC Gould School of Law's International Human Rights Clinic, and engage students in legal representation and advocacy for upholding fundamental human rights for all. In addition, I do teach in the areas of international criminal law and transitional justice. I've been a legal officer and deputy chef de cabinet at the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals, visiting professor at the International Criminal Court, Amici Counsel in the Afghanistan hearing at the ICC, and a senior legal advisor to the Cambodia Tribunal. So relevant for this briefing, since the end of 2017, the USC Clinic has been calling attention to the unfolding crisis in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, making detailed factual and legal submissions documenting serious violations of international human rights law to officials at international and regional bodies. In addition, the clinic has been briefing the US Congress and Departments of State and Treasury on the crisis. Currently, the clinic is preparing a detailed report documenting ongoing abuses against the civilian Anglophone population, including through in-depth interviews with dozens of refugees, with a view to assist any future investigations of perpetrators. So what is the current situation in Cameroon? In the Northwest and Southwest regions, it is nothing short of an atrocity situation, consisting of widespread and systematic crimes against humanity, against the civilian population, and serious violations of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, against civilians as protected persons, amounting to war crimes. Some non-governmental organizations are now warning of an impending genocide. The current armed crisis began in 2016 when security forces cracked down with violent use of force against widespread peaceful protests organized by Anglophone lawyers and teachers against discriminatory policies in the legal system and schools. Now, after 4 years of escalating civil unrest between government forces and non-state armed groups, Cameroon faces a humanitarian catastrophe exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Over 200 villages have been burnt to the ground. There have been widespread killings, currently estimated on the ground around 5,000 to 6,000, forced disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, rape, and other acts of sexual violence, and more than 700,000 civilians forcibly displaced from their homes, with over 60,000 across the border in Nigeria and tens of thousands elsewhere. It is estimated that 81% of children in the Anglophone region, over 800,000, have been unable to attend school since 2017. And for the past 2 years, Cameroon has topped the list of most neglected crises as published by the Norwegian Refugee Council, with around 3 million in need of humanitarian assistance. So what must be done? First, the violence must stop. For too long, over 4 years now, the international community has stood by or taken insufficient action while an atrocity situation has unfolded before our eyes. It is imperative that we do so to prevent an escalation to genocide. Second, there must be accountability for the abuses already perpetrated. We in the clinic respectfully request the Canadian government to work together with the African Union states and relevant Western governments, such as the United States, the UK, and EU member states, particularly France, to address the situation in Cameroon as follows. First, issue strong resolutions such as the recent US Senate Resolution 684 of 1st January 2021, condemning the ongoing serious human rights abuses and calling for targeted global Magnitsky sanctions against perpetrators on both sides of the conflict to signal that the international community is watching. Second, implement targeted Magnitsky sanctions in coordination with other governments in order to encourage a ceasefire and discussions towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Third, consider acting as a neutral third-party mediator, perhaps as part of a coalition of states to facilitate inclusive dialogue between the parties for ending the conflict. Fourth, support efforts towards establishing a fact-finding commission of inquiry through the UN or the AU to investigate the atrocities. And finally, work to end impunity for atrocity crimes that have been perpetrated thus far through judicial proceedings, whether through support for a case against Cameroon before the International Court of Justice or investigation of perpetrators by national, regional, or international criminal jurisdictions, such as the ICC. In conclusion, we urge Canada to play a leading role in intervening in the Cameroon situation as a member of the Commonwealth that has provided humanitarian and security aid to the country. Achieving peace and justice in Cameroon is critical, not only because of the numerous victims of atrocity crimes, but also for promoting regional stability, stopping refugee flows, and facilitating effective counterterrorism efforts. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gary. And now we'll move to Mr. Fominyen.
Honorable Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity that's been given to me to address you today with regards to the armed conflict in Cameroon. Monsieur le Président et honorable député.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you regarding the ongoing conflict in Cameroon and the possible contribution Canada could make towards a negotiated end of the conflict and an exhaustive settlement of the real and legitimate grievances of the Anglophone people. I will give my presentation in English, but I will gladly answer questions in either French or English, depending on the language it's asked in.
By Professor Gary, and update with regards to the number of children who are now out of school, to state that the number as of today has gone up from 800,000 kids to 1.1 million kids. Because she spoke about the status report, I'll go straight to the causes. The root causes of this crisis can be summarized in the Botch reunification on October 1, 1961, of the former British Southern Cameroons with the Republic of Cameroon to form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. Over the years, this has been aggravated, in fact, during the past 60 years, by a bad faith effort by the Francophone-led central government to assimilate the Anglophone minority into the Francophone majority. Since October 1, 1960, Cameroon has known only two presidents, both Francophones and strong proponents of a highly centralized Jacobin system of government. Hence, the frustrations of Anglophones and the disaffection has grown for decades, driven in large part by government actions, including one, the May 1972 abolition of the Federal Republic of Cameroon and adoption of the United Republic of Cameroon. Two, the February 1984 reversion of the country's name from the United Republic of Cameroon to the Republic of Cameroon which coincides with the territory that obtained independence from France on January 1, 1960. 3, the October 1992 first competitive presidential election in Cameroon's history, with a contested outcome in which an Anglophone was declared the runner-up, whereas he and many of his supporters felt that he had won the race. And the April 2008 constitutional amendment, which undid presidential term limits and allowed the current president, Paul Biya, to serve as president for life. What are my major concerns today? I've got 3. Currently, I would like to draw the committee's attention to 3 main concerns. 1, the government's inclination to use the military and brute force to resolve otherwise genuine, legitimate political grievances of Anglophones. 2, the continuous poisoning of minds and furtherance of disaffection and polarization because of the killings and atrocities currently being perpetrated in former British Southern Cameroon. And 3, the lukewarm attitude of the international community beyond a few declarations and now Resolution 684 of the United States Senate adopted on January 1, 2021. Recommendation. Honorable Chairman, members of the committee, Canada is in a unique position to contribute to an end to the armed conflict and the search for a negotiated solution that addresses the root causes. Canada has a proud history of managing cultural diversity and heritage and peacemaking. Canada is the only country that, like Cameroon, sits on both the Commonwealth of Nations and the Francophonie. It has mutually respectful relationships across Africa and with European countries that it could leverage and galvanize to help end the killings and atrocities being committed today in Cameroon. I therefore submit the following recommendations for your consideration. 1, call for an immediate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and a public commitment by the government of Cameroon and non-state actors to negotiations with third-party facilitation. 2, use your good offices to engage France so she can leverage her privileged position with the government of Cameroon to get the government to commit to peace negotiations to bring an end to the conflict and address its root causes. 3, adopt targeted sanctions against the perpetrators of mass killings, torture, and other atrocities in the ongoing conflict. And 4, use Canada's position on multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, and even NATO to ensure that resources granted to Cameroon for development purposes are not diverted to execute a war against its people whose only crime is to be a minority with a distinct history and genuine political grievances.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
your time and
Fominyen.
attention.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move to Mr. Tembon for 5 minutes, sir, please. Thank you. You're on mute, if you could unmute.
Okay, good. Yeah, honorable members of parliament, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to share in this hearing and to be able to share about what's going on in Southern Cameroon. A civil protest movement in the Southern Cameroons against systemic oppression and what most Southern Cameroonians consider recolonization transformed into a major crisis in 2016. Rather than engaging in peaceful dialogue, the Cameroon government cut the internet, used disproportionate force and helicopter gunships.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Tembon. If you could put your microphone, your headset back on, just for the interpreter so they can hear better, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So rather than use engage in peaceful dialogue, the Cameroon government cut the internet and used disproportionate force and helicopter gunships against peaceful protesters, resulting in several deaths. And as the protests continued, the killing also continued. And some Southern Cameroonians groups formed armed groups and started to fight back. And the Cameroon president declared war. and it's transformed into a lot of chaos, into mass killing, and a lot of crime that is going on. So it's resulted in thousands of deaths, as my colleagues have already said, hundreds of thousands of people who are internally displaced, about 100,000 refugees in neighboring countries, and children who have not gone to school for about the last 4 years. When we look at this conflict, some analysts have described it as Rwanda in slow motion due to the mass killing, extrajudicial and summary executions, and rampant human rights abuses. And there is overwhelming evidence of ongoing systemic atrocities carried out on the population of the southern Cameroons. These atrocities amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The responsibility to protect was coined in the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty report that was set up by the Canadian government in December of 2001. The work of the committee was to make sure that the international community never again fails to stop genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, Western governments so far have put economic values above human rights in their dealings with the Biya government in Cameroon and are playing bystander to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. By doing nothing, these countries are fully supporting these atrocities. Canada can be an exception. There is an urgency for the international community to live up to its responsibility to protect, help facilitate negotiations to resolve the root causes of the conflict, carry out an international investigation, and refer perpetrators of these atrocities to the International Criminal Court. We request this committee and the Canadian government to invoke the doctrine of the responsibility to protect in the southern Cameroons, to call for international mediation to resolve the root causes of the conflict and self-determination for southern Cameroons, ask the Commonwealth to expel Cameroon from the body and call for international sanctions against Cameroon's leaders and all those who are carrying out atrocities in southern Cameroons, and refer the case to the International Criminal Court to hold perpetrators of these crimes accountable. Thank you very much.
Mr. Tembon, thank you very much, and to all our witnesses for your opening statements. I am going to just reiterate with the members, in about 25 minutes or so, we will have an e-vote. As soon as we hear, we'll suspend. We'll all vote as quickly as we possibly can, and I ask that you just come right back onto the platform, so that I don't even know if we have to go off the platform, clerk, right? We just stay on, vote, and then as soon as we're all done, then we can restart the meeting. So it will lead into some of our time. I'll add that onto the end. We're going to start our questioning with Ms. Anita Vandenbeld from the Liberals for 7 minutes. Anita.
Yes, thank you very much. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here this evening on what is a very, very significant issue, but one that we don't hear much in the media. And I'm particularly interested in what you were saying about Canada's unique position in terms of multilateral partners and being able to lead, particularly on impunity, because we know that when I hear the words genocide, when I hear, I know one of the witnesses said that, we're in a position now where we could prevent a genocide. One of the keys to that is rule of law and impunity. So I would like to hear from the witnesses about what it is specifically that Canada could do, but also what we could do in partnership with other multilateral partners to ensure that we end impunity. You could go in the same order that you spoke. That would be good.
And just please unmute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Very important question. So in my mind, I think that Canada as a member state of the International Criminal Court is in a particularly good position to potentially support any efforts made by the prosecutor's office towards investigation. potentially. Now, as you may know, Cameroon is not a member state of the International Criminal Court. However, because there are so many refugees fleeing across the border into Nigeria, there could be a jurisdictional nexus there on the basis of territory. And already the prosecutor is investigating in Nigeria with regard to other circumstances and alleged crimes. But there is potentially the possibility for the prosecutor to look into things proprio motu. There also may be the possibility for Canada to perhaps refer the situation to the International Criminal Court as a states party. Another thing, in terms of your question with regard to multilateral efforts, I would strongly encourage Canada. I know you're not on the Security Council at the moment, but to use your influence to negotiate with those sitting on the Security Council to call for an open official discussion. There was an ARIA in 2019, but something more needs to be done and statements need to be made by the Security Council to notice the situation, address it, and to call it what it is. Thank you.
If I may add in response to Honorable Anita's question, one of the challenges with the conflict in Cameroon is that we don't have access to the most updated information. That once in a while there's a massive atrocity like the massacre in Gabu or the massacre of school children in Kumba, and everyone cries out. But there's lives being lost on a daily basis. One of the things that Canada can do is to lead the calls for an official international fact-finding mission that will be able to go into the conflict areas and collect the data that's required to let the world know how many lives have been lost, how many people are in the bushes, how many people have been affected, how many people are in detention, so that we can have a specific data to work with. Without such a high level fact-finding mission, that's right now a lot of propaganda on social media. No one owns up to atrocities that are committed unless there's proof that that party has been identified with a specific act of massacre or a specific violation of human rights. So a fact-finding mission would be a good place to start. And from there, we would be able to identify the perpetrators and work to bring them to justice. Because of the very polarized nature of this conflict, it's incredibly difficult. It's going to be incredibly difficult for justice to be meted by parties that are themselves parties to the conflict. And that's why there's a very strong emphasis in finding ways to bring the perpetrators of the massacres before international jurisdiction and to help work with other countries to make that possible. I think even though Cameroon is a signatory but hasn't ratified the Rome Convention, there are other member states that are being impacted by this conflict, whose actions could also facilitate an investigation by the ICC and jurisdiction being taken up by that institution that would help us deal with the issues of impunity. It's also important to see sanctions as one way of curbing impunity, because once targeted sanctions are meted out against the perpetrators, then it sends a very strong signal that the world is watching and that impunity will no longer be accepted. Thank you.
Yeah, I will also add to what my colleagues have said. Canada can work alongside other countries. There's been some movement within the US with the Senate resolution. There is some initiative also going on in Germany. And so if Canada can join these efforts, that will really help, because Cameroon has decided to just not care about resolutions, but I think there's a need for some more pressure to happen to bring the Cameroon leaders around a negotiation table where they can discuss and handle and settle the root causes of the conflict, but also a ceasefire. If you can work together alongside other countries to bring a ceasefire, that will help.
Thank you. I did want to ask about the school children and the impact on gender and on
About 20
girls,
seconds.
but I don't think any of you have
Yeah.
a chance to answer. So if in the future rounds you have a chance, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we're moving to the Conservatives with Mr. Kenny Chu for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming to the subcommittee for to update us on the situation of Cameroon. I got a question that I would like to hear from each of you, starting from Mr. Tembon in reverse, Mr. Fominyen, and then Ms. Gary. COVID-19 has pretty much stopped the world in many areas. I'd like to hear from you what the situations of Cameroon is vis-a-vis with the COVID-19 impact, whether it stopped some of the conflicts or it has actually created even worse situations for the civilians there.
Yeah, I think COVID has created even a very difficult situation for the people because the government takes advantage of that to clamp down and take away the rights of the people. Most of the people in those regions are living in the bushes, in those villages where houses have been destroyed. They don't have access to information, even information about COVID, how to prevent that, because they're living in bushes, in the forest. And so it makes it a bit difficult for the people in those communities. Some are living in very crowded areas. And so when you talk about social distancing, you don't have that going on in those, especially in the southern Cameroons.
Honorable members, you may be aware of the fact that in 2020, the UN Secretary General issued a statement calling for a global ceasefire because of COVID-19, and that the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2532, actually asking countries and warring factions around the globe to embrace the ceasefire because of COVID-19. Obviously, that resolution didn't have any meaning in Cameroon, and some of the worst massacres that we saw occurred in 2020, right in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The concern now, the urgency now, is that as Africa braces itself for the second wave of COVID-19, if nothing is done to bring about a ceasefire right now, that the crisis is only going to be aggravated by the exposure that ordinary citizens have to the COVID-19 pandemic, with very little or no access to medical facilities, especially in the conflict areas. Thank you.
Ms. Gary?
Thank you. I don't have a whole lot to add to my colleagues, other than to note that with the arbitrary detentions and other abuses, they have been exacerbated because of the pandemic and COVID. And obviously, as Mr. Tembon stated, with the forced displacement and folks living in the bush and in very close quarters, it has made circumstances very difficult. And then I would also note that, with regard to, we are seeing, with regard to trials and fair trials, that the COVID pandemic has been used as pretext to deny folks due process.
Thank you. Thank you. You have mentioned, all of you have mentioned earlier that the government has committed atrocities and taken advantage of COVID, for example, to further instigate worse massacre, et cetera, But according to the information provided to us, the atrocities actually were committed on both sides, also the separatists as well. Can you tell me what you have suggested, exerting international pressure, applying Magnitsky sanction and all that, can only be applicable mostly to regime, to the government itself. So is there any suggestion that you have that would Canada can do to actually force both sides, especially the separatist side, from taking up arms and from hurting the civilian populations? Ms. Gary, let's reverse the order then.
So our position in the clinic is that with regard to alleged atrocities on the ground, it is important to investigate and look at both sides. And Indeed, there are alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity with regard to armed non-state actors, separatist groups as well. In terms of putting pressure, I think that the Magnitsky sanctions are one way to go about this, in addition to looking at alleged government perpetrators. Magnitsky sanctions can be imposed not just on government, but also non-state actors.
Thank you. Mr. Fominyen?
I would say, I would just add to that, I think everyone who calls for thorough investigations, and especially an international fact-finding mission, is open to having atrocities identified with whichever party is culpable or responsible. There's always the danger to try to rationalize or relativize. And while both sides have committed atrocities, there's a pattern of atrocities that are committed by uniformed officers and atrocities that are committed by the non-state actors who, for the most part, are very involved in crimes such as kidnappings for ransom and sometimes targeting of individuals whom they see as supporters of the state. There's a lot of work to be done, but for that work to be done, a high-level fact-finding mission would help operate in a very non-partisan way and bring to the fore all of those that are guilty of those atrocities.
Thank you, Mr. Tembon.
Yes, while both sides, there have been atrocities committed by armed groups, some horrible atrocities, the government has committed the worst kind of atrocities you can imagine. From the facts we have gathered, it's horrible what they have done, and I support the idea of to get a fact-finding mission on the ground that will help us see what's going on in the southern Cameroons. It's difficult to put an equivalence between both sides because the government is armed, supported by the international community. Armed groups are hiding in their communities, trying to defend themselves. And then through defending themselves, they commit some really horrible crimes too. But I would suggest that a fact-finding mission go into the southern Cameroons to bring out the truth.
Thank you. In the remaining time that I may not have.
Yeah, no, you don't. Thank you, Mr. Chu. Yeah, so we're moving now to the block, and Monsieur Alexis Brunel Duceppe for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. Frankly, your responses are very important and very pertinent. I don't have much time, so I may need to cut you off because I have several questions I'd like to ask you. The first, history has taught us that in the past, when you deal with this kind of conflict, women and children are often the primary victims. I'd like to hear you on this matter. We've heard about some of this in the media, but I think we have to raise awareness of the public to get more support. Perhaps Mr. Tembon first? Thank you very much for that question. It is indeed a pertinent question. Women and children suffer the most in this type of conflict. There are more than 1 million children who have not gone to school for 4 years now. It's a very sad situation. Some children have been burned in their homes by the military. When the military invade a village, and of course, people flee, and the women and children who cannot flee are burned alive in their homes. A few days ago, I know of a father and baby who was burned. We saw videos in the social media, and the father is holding the baby in his hands while burning. So there are other occasions when children have been shot and killed. And women, of course, have been attacked. So they are victims of the conflict. So amongst the civilian population, women and children are the hardest hit. The international community must intervene. Thank you. Mr. Fominyen? Yes, I'd like to add 2 points. The first images we saw of the conflict in 2017. We saw the villages burning, and we saw a mother burn in her home. And since then, there have been many criminal acts targeting women and children. We have a brief of a jail guard who's also been a witness. We don't have all the facts. Then, of course, you have the displaced internally. There are many women and young girls among these. And you also have victims in the big cities. And some of the young women who have been displaced must live from prostitution in the cities. And this is why actions need to be taken, comprehensive actions and immediate ones, to do away with this dirty war. Ms. Gary? Professor Gary, go ahead, please.
Thank you for this really important question. A couple of points. First, I just want to echo my fellow witnesses that we do not have the facts sufficiently with regard to this question. And it is something we've come across in our clinic as we've been doing our detailed report. The reports and the fact-finding that have been done so far by international human rights groups have overlooked and not detailed sufficiently the harm done to women and children. And so we've made a point of specifically doing in-depth interviews with refugees on this question. One thing that is becoming of increasing concern is child soldiers and forcible recruitment of children to join in and be part of the conflict, and concerns that this might become another Sierra Leone type situation. And so I would just flag that for you. In our in-depth interviews and our anecdotal evidence with women, we've heard about rape and sexual violence being used as weapons of war in the conflict. And a fact-finding inquiry and commission specifically on the treatment of these two groups in the population is critically in need. I can't emphasize that enough.
Thank you very much. Earlier, Mr. Tembon, in his statement on Rwanda, and now we've just heard about Sierra Leone. So these are examples, and it shows that those countries neighboring Cameroon, what has their conduct been in regard to the conflict in the Cameroon? The neighboring countries, Nigeria, for instance, these countries have been leaders. So Nigeria supports Cameroon. They are a partner, of course, in their fight against Boko Haram. But then you have Chad, Central Africa, that has its own products. Chad depends on Cameroon, so because of the pipelines. And then there's Gabon. But all of these neighboring countries are, of course, influenced by France. France has a position of indifference, or it supports. Well, they hide behind non-interference. And what about the African Union in all this? Well, it hasn't pronounced itself. I myself have tried to attend the meetings. They've refused to meet with us. I think they're waiting for a direction from France. It's a club of presidents, and they're protecting each other. If I might clarify regarding the African Union, because they do function on the basis of solidarity. So sub-regionally, the countries must become involved. Then sub-regionally, there can be calls on the African Union. Cameroon is not in the sub-region of the West. It's in the central region. So the members of Central Africa are not as open because none of these countries has an Anglophone minority. So none of these countries are particularly sensitive to the issues unfolding in Cameroon.
Just before members, we move into our second round of questions. Got an update on the e-vote, and it looks like it's going to be around 7:30 or so. Just so you're aware. So we're going to move into our second round. As soon as we hear, we'll suspend.
Chair, I think I didn't get my chance on the first round.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Ms. McPherson, I apologize. But just going to, we'll bring you in right now, Ms. McPherson. And just for those, yeah. So as soon as we, it looks like the e-vote's going to happen closer to around 7:30-ish now. And Ms. McPherson for 7 minutes in the first round to conclude our first round. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just making sure I'm actually going to get my time, because it was very interesting to listen.
Me on my toes. Yes.
It was very interesting to listen to the witnesses. Thank you very much for being here and sharing this information with us. Of course, it's very horrifying to hear, and I'm deeply concerned of the information that you've brought to us today. In particular, I'm quite concerned when we hear things like genocide, when we hear impending genocide, when we hear things like a slow Rwanda. So we know that the media often plays a really important role in these kinds of conflicts, these kinds of human rights abuses. So I would really like some information on how the media is playing a role in this particular conflict. Maybe if I could start with you, Professor Gary.
Thank you. I'm actually going to defer to the other two witnesses. I don't feel sufficiently authoritative on that question. Thank you.
Dr. Fominyen, I'm sorry, yes. I'm sure that was incorrectly pronounced.
No, that's fine, honorable member. It's unfortunate that the media, the international media, doesn't have as much access, and the local media, the national media, sometimes has felt constrained in its ability to go into the conflict zones and to report adequately and honestly on the impact of this conflict. Because media relations in Cameroon are also deplorable, and there are a whole host of journalists in prison. I mean, that could be the subject of a separate hearing. And so the space for media reporting is very restrained in Cameroon. Even the space for international human rights organizations is probably non-existent. That explains why organizations have got to rely on other sources to be able to obtain information. And I think a fact-finding mission would also open up the space for media to be able to go in and do adequate reporting on the current crisis.
Thank you. Mr. Tembon.
Yeah, I think according to the Community to Protect Journalists, Cameroon is one of the worst places for journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. Many journalists have been killed. Some are in prison. It's been a very, very difficult time for journalists. International media outlets have not really covered Cameroon that well, the conflict that well. BBC has done some work reporting some massacres, reporting some issues that are going on and interviewing people. But what the work that has really been done well has been done by human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and even right there in Canada, there is the University of Toronto has a project, the database project of the University of Toronto that is collecting data on the atrocities. So some of that information will be found right there. And there are many other organizations that are also collecting data about what's going on. Oxford University has a project that has been studying the conflict, the root causes, and also collecting data. So those have helped. But as far as the media, the international media, or even local media, it's been very difficult because of the violence. It's difficult to actually go in there. The government soldiers or even the other fighters on the ground don't let you easily on the ground to cover what's going on.
So the local media, though, just to be clear, the local media is not stirring up, is not making the conflict worse. It is not inflaming the conflict from your perspective.
Or they were. In the beginning, it wasn't easy because you have the media, the Southern Cameroon journalists who want to report what's going on. They are silenced. but you have the public media that is being used.
Okay.
Yeah, it's being used to stir problems, a lot of hate speech, even through the media, not just social media, but also the media. We've gathered a lot of that information that's been used by the government media, or media houses that support the government against what's going on.
And social media is part of that as well. I think I overheard you say. I heard you say.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, and I guess when we look at this, and you talk about the international media not covering this, that it is not getting this conflict is not getting the international attention it needs from the multilateral institutions that we work with, bilateral relationships. Why do you think that is? I mean, why are we not seeing the United Nations act? Why is this such a slow-moving ship at the moment, I guess? And has there been any change? I guess I'll add a question onto that. Any change now that we have a new administration in the U.S. that seems much more interested in playing a meaningful role internationally? Have we seen a change at all yet?
Okay, I think I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we've been troubled by the relationship between the Western governments and Cameroon.
Mm-hmm.
Because Cameroon, each time we talk, especially with the U.S. leadership, they say, "Oh, Cameroon is a partner," even though they are carrying out horrific abuses. They see them as a partner because of the interest of these different Western governments in Cameroon. So they look away when atrocity is committed. When I look at people like Mugabe, I don't think Mugabe did a tenth of what Mr. Biya has done. But Mr. Biya goes away with what's going on. The other issue is Mr. Biya and his government hired Western lobbies in DC. In our advocacy work, we had to fight against those lobby firms that deal with the media, lobby firms that deal with people in politics. And so it's not an easy, it's like struggling to go through a concrete wall. So I'm happy that we are getting this access now to be able to share with parliaments and with other politicians and getting some inroads. But it's not been easy because of French interest in the region, and also just because of the fight against Boko Haram. It clouded issues because Cameroon is one of the countries involved in the fight against Boko Haram in the Sahel. And that makes it difficult for the Western governments that are involved. They are in a very difficult position. How do they fight against this crime that's going on and also have Cameroon as a partner against Boko Haram?
Thank you. And if
Thank
either
you,
of the
Ms.
other,
Pearson.
I'm out of time.
That's your time for now. Yes, we're moving into the second round, and but at one point the vote will come up. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to divide the time up to about 2.5 minutes for each of the parties. We're starting with Ms. Ikra Khalid from the Liberal Party for 2.5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I just want to pick up on some of the recommendations that the witnesses have made. There are a lot of similarities, and a lot of the things that you're asking for are very similar. Just one thing I want to ask Professor Gary, and then I'll maybe ask Dr. Fominyen to also comment on it. Now, Professor, you had, in one of your recommendations, asked for a fact-finding commission. And Dr. Fominyen had said that military has been used to resolve political differences, etc. Now, how would you describe, or how do you think it would be best to develop or to get access for that fact-finding commission? Would the current government be able to, or would they find it desirable to do so? So I'll start with you, Professor, and then I'll ask Dr. Fominyen to also comment.
Thank you for that question. It's a very important one. I think that establishing a fact-finding mission or commission of inquiry obviously has to be done through multilateral fora, either through the United Nations or through the African Union, and in coordination with states that can apply pressure on the current government to allow for access to the impacted regions in particular, and also obviously for there to be ensured security for those investigators in the process. Without a multilateral sort of independent commission, I don't think it would be possible, as you note, given the instability in the regions, and given the current state of denial, frankly, by the current government with regard to what's going on.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fominyen?
Yes, I'll just echo that and add that in previous atrocities that have been committed in countries such as Myanmar, and we saw that with the Rohingya massacres or genocide, that the United Nations Human Rights Commission was instrumental in that regard. And I think if Canada begins to take the lead with some of its partners, it can galvanize the amount of international attention that's required to then get the United Nations Human Rights Commission to step forward and take responsibility to conduct such a high-level fact-finding mission.
Thank you. I think that concludes my time. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're moving to Mr. Scott Reed for 2.5, 3 minutes. Scott, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are comparisons being made to Rwanda, which strikes me as perhaps not being fully accurate. One of the characteristics of Rwanda, it seems to me, was you had two conflicting groups within a country that was seen as being essentially geographically indissoluble. And so there was a battle in that context. In the case of what's going on in Cameroon, there's an area, southern Cameroon, which has declared itself, or at least some participants there have declared it to be an independent Republic of Ambazonia. And so the obvious question arises of how one deals with that question. Is there a realistic prospect of convincing the people who have tried to declare independence that they should be rejoined to and be satisfied with being a part of Cameroon as long as certain things are guaranteed for them? And alternatively, is it the case that the Cameroon government could ever be reconciled with this area becoming independent? You have to have one side concede to the other side winning it on this issue. I'm not sure which side it should be, or else you can never actually come to a resolution, just to an unending conflict. So I'm not sure to throw that to. Why don't we start with Professor Gary and then see who else can comment on it.
Thank you for that question. So in the clinic, we personally do not take a position with regard to political outcomes here, but and the solution with regard to the Northwest and Southwest regions. But what we do take a position on is that the parties, there needs to be pressure put on for an inclusive dialogue where all options are on the table and there is real discussion with regard to each of the opposing perspectives on the regions and what the outcome should be. I will pass it off to, I think, Dr. Fominyen and Mr. Tembon, who have more in detail to say about this.
Okay, great.
Honorable member, your question just underscores the need for a negotiated solution to this crisis, because between 1961, reunification 1961, and 2016, no one in what was the former British Southern Cameroons was killed because of being an Anglophone. Between 2016 and today, thousands of people have been killed, villages have been burned, people are internally displaced, people are refugees. There is no way that this population is going to all of a sudden reconcile itself without a negotiated solution to the crisis. Secondly, there was an opinion poll that was conducted in the Anglophone communities about 2 years ago that showed that around 68% of the population wanted to go their separate ways. 2 years later, in 2020, a second opinion poll was conducted that showed that that number had risen to 86%, which means that the more that the government persists with a military solution to this crisis, the more it's going to antagonize the population to the point where reconciliation may become extremely difficult, if not impossible. And it's in everyone's interest that the parties be brought to the table right now to be able to sort out their differences and come out with a position that will stop the killings and create an environment in which people can coexist or live side by side or together.
Thank you. And now we'll move to Monsieur Alexis Brunel-Duceppe for, again, about 3 minutes.
Thank you. This will be my last opportunity, so I want to thank all three of you for appearing as witnesses. The work you're doing is very important. I'm going to go very quickly. All three of you talked about the school children who have been affected by this conflict. Mr. Fominyen talked about 1.6 million who hadn't been to school in 4 years. Others say that the government has targeted schools and school children, yet others will say, well, it's the separatists who have targeted the schools and school children. Could you please enlighten us, Mr. Fominyen? And sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Not at all. There has been confusion about that issue, but it's evolved over time. At the beginning, when the crisis began, people asked the kids not to go to school because the schools were at the center of the conflict. So people did not want the kids to go to school because they didn't want them to become a part of negotiation. That it's become a habit. So now for some 4 years, schools have been shut for the most part. We have seen cases where some schools wanted to reopen. And they have taken into account the needs in the different localities. So some schools have been reopening with their own school programs. There has been confusion, but in the rural areas where there have not been much presence and where schools are controlled by armed groups, schools are not open. That's some 80% of those areas. So how is the local population coping? How is it reacting to this state of affairs? The local population, of course, is living out the consequences. They're not able to negotiate with the armed groups, nor can they negotiate with the states. So they are taken hostage and experiencing the very negative consequences. And of course, many have transferred their children to neighboring areas of the Cameroon where children are trying to go to school. Thank you to all three of you, and also thanks to my colleagues who have asked excellent questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're moving to our final questioner, Ms. Heather McPherson, for about approximately 3 minutes before we're going to get to our e-question, our e-vote.
Our vote. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to all our witnesses for being here. I did want to ask a little bit on something that Dr. Fominyen had mentioned about humanitarian aid, about development assistance, and how that might be able to be used as a tool. I guess what I wanted to get a little bit of sense is would you like to see Canada examine our development dollars that go to Cameroon? Would you like us to withhold those dollars until the Cameroonian government agrees to a ceasefire, agrees to negotiations? And I guess, in your opinion, would that influence the Cameroonian government? Would that be a tool that Canada could use effectively?
Certainly, it can be a tool, and I think it should be put on the table because the ultimate goal is to get the parties to stop killing each other and to come to a negotiation table. So if that can help as an incentive, then it should be utilized. The concerns that I have are born out of the experience that we've seen on the field, where, for example, material assistance that was given to the Cameroon military to fight Boko Haram in the extreme northern part of the country got diverted and transferred into the British Southern Cameroons, or the Southern Cameroons, the Northwest and the Southwest, to be engaged in that theater of operation. And so there's the sense that as long as the government continues to have resources, then it's not going to feel compelled to seek ways to get to the negotiating table and to bring all the parties to the table so that this can be sorted out through a negotiated solution. And I think whatever leverage Canada has should be put to use.
Okay, and perhaps does Mr. Tembon or Professor Gary any comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to say Professor Chris Roberts, who is of a political scientist at the Calgary University, has done some research on Canada's collaboration with Cameroon, and it's telling in terms of the values Canada promotes at home. In that dealing with Cameroon, it hasn't promoted the same values when it comes to the contracts, government support, and business with Cameroon. They have just overlooked the human rights issues, these atrocities, and have gone ahead to do business with Cameroon. And I think that's something Canada needs to look at. But I don't think that would deter Cameroon from continuing what they're doing. They are very determined. It would take more pressure and more serious work alongside other countries to stop these atrocities from happening.
So it could only be part of the solution.
Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Gary?
Yeah,
Gary.
If I could just jump in on the point of coming alongside other countries doing the same. So the U.S. has been looking closely at its defense aid and withdrawing defense aid and military training under the Leahy laws here in the United States. They did so a couple of years ago. They also withdrew trade benefits. So I think these are important initiatives that, especially when done with other countries, can put pressure on the government.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'll pass it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson, and thank you to the witnesses on behalf of all committee members and all those that pulled this together. We thank you for your testimony. Thank you for the answers that you've provided us. From this hearing, what we will have is a statement will be published, and once that statement is published, that will be forwarded to all of you. So thank you very much on behalf of the committee. We really appreciate it. Members, we have not got the notice yet for the e-vote. I thought we would have had it by now, and it would have been a good transition. So, Madam Clerk, it looks like we're going to move into our I guess our second round, right?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if you could just suspend for a moment while I switch out the witnesses, that'd be great.
Sure, let's do that. Okay, members will suspend. Thank you.